was a sharp, cold moment. The security stopped old woman at the war memorial, his voice echoing with impatience. "Ma'am, you can't be here," he snapped, physically blocking her path. Tourists stared, embarrassed by the confrontation. The old woman simply looked at him, her eyes clear and steady. She spoke, her voice quiet but absolute. And when she said Silver Hawk, everyone froze. The world just stopped. A nearby general went pale. The guard's hand hung in the air, his authority vanishing. Who was this woman? If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and comment where you're watching from. You see, the day didn't begin with a confrontation. It began, as most of Emily's days did, in the quiet, pre-dawn gray of her small Arlington apartment. The light was thin, watery. Emily, well, she was what you'd call spry for her age, which was a polite way of saying she moved with the careful, deliberate economy of someone whose joints had kept score of every year. She was 86. Her apartment was immaculate, a tiny museum of a life lived quietly. There were no grand photos on the wall, no trophies, just a few faded pictures of young men in uniform, smiling, their arms slung around each other, a lifetime ago. On this particular morning, November 11th, she moved with even more purpose. She didn't eat. She just drank her black coffee, standing, looking out the window toward the Potomac. She was preparing. In her bedroom, laid out on the bed, was not a fancy dress, but a simple dark blue wool coat, impeccably clean, and a small, worn leather clutch. Tucked inside that clutch, wrapped in a silk handkerchief, was a single, tarnished medal. It wasn't one of the big ones, not a Medal of Honor or a Silver Star, but something quiet, something few would recognize. To anyone else, she was just an old woman getting ready for a chilly day out. Maybe to feed the pigeons. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd see the set of her jaw. You'd see the way her eyes, the color of a faded sky, held a focus that was unnerving. This wasn't a casual outing. This was a mission. She left her apartment at 700. She checked her watch, an old analog thing. A man's watch, its leather strap cracked with age. It still kept perfect time. She didn't take a taxi. She wouldn't dream of it. She walked the 3 blocks to the bus stop, her posture straighter than women half her age. When the bus arrived, the driver barely glanced at her as she paid her senior fare. She was just part of the city's scenery. She sat by the window watching Arlington National Cemetery slide by. A silent green ocean of identical white stones. She wasn't going there. Not today. Her destination was across the river. She was going to the mall, to the long, stark black wall of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and then to the chilling, evocative stainless steel figures of the Korean War Veterans Memorial. She had ghosts at both. As the bus crossed the memorial bridge, the sun finally broke through the clouds, glinting off the Washington Monument. The city was waking up, full of joggers and government workers clutching their briefcases. They were all moving fast, consumed by the now. Emily was moving toward the then. She was a ghost from another time, moving invisibly through their world, carrying a weight they couldn't possibly comprehend. Now, let's talk about Marcus. Marcus was not a bad guy. You have to understand that. He was young, barely 24, working security for a private contractor hired by the Park Service. He liked the uniform. He liked the sense of importance, of being the line between order and chaos, even if that chaos was usually just a tourist stepping on the grass or a high school group being too loud. He'd been working the Korean War Memorial detail for 6 months. It was, in his opinion, a boring post. It was cold, and the statues, well, they kind of creeped him out, especially in the early morning fog. They looked too real, too haunted. Marcus was ambitious. He saw this as a stepping stone. Maybe to the Secret Service. Maybe just to a better-paying gig. His primary concern today was the 0900 wreath-laying ceremony. A few VIPs were coming, a senator, a 4-star general from the Pentagon, some Korean dignitaries. His boss had been clear. Keep the path clear. No disruptions. Look sharp. Marcus was looking sharp. His boots were shined, his jacket pressed. He stood near the entrance to the main path, a small discreet rope and stanchion barrier set up to keep the general public in the designated viewing area, away from the pool of remembrance where the VIPs would gather. He scanned the small crowd, a few families, a handful of older men wearing Vietnam veteran caps, and a couple of school buses unloading students. Standard. Then, at 08:30, he saw her. Emily. She'd walked from the bus stop, moving slowly but with that unwavering pace. To Marcus, she was a blip, a small elderly woman in a plain coat, clutching her purse. She looked like 1,000 other elderly tourists he saw every week. She looked to his young, preoccupied eyes like a non-entity. He gave her a polite, dismissive nod as she passed, his eyes already scanning for the real potential problems, the protesters, the overly aggressive photographers. He didn't see her stop. He didn't see her gaze fix on the granite wall that read, "Freedom is not free." He didn't see her hand tremble as she stood before the 19 stainless steel soldiers moving through the juniper bushes. He just saw an old lady, and that was his first mistake. The first encounter was quiet. You would have missed it if you weren't watching. Emily approached the roped-off path that led to the pool of remembrance. The ceremony wasn't for another 30 minutes, but Marcus was already in his gatekeeper mode. He saw her veer off the public walkway and stepped directly into her path. His voice was polite but firm, the kind you use for a child or someone you assume is confused. "Ma'am?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, this area is closed for a private event." He smiled. A professional plastic smile. Emily stopped. She looked at the rope, then at him. Her voice was quiet, not frail but soft. "I need to be there." Marcus's smile tightened. "I understand, ma'am, but this section is for the official party. The public viewing area is over there." He pointed. "You'll get a great view from there." Emily didn't look where he was pointing. Her eyes stayed on him. "I am not the public. I need to be at the pool." This was the moment. The first ripple. Marcus felt a small prickle of annoyance. He hated this part. The entitled tourists, the confused elderly. He softened his voice, adopting a patronizing tone. I know, it's an important day, but the rules are for everyone. The general will be arriving shortly and we need to keep this clear." He was trying to be helpful, to manage her. He saw her as a problem to be solved, a box to be checked. Emily just stood there. She seemed to be weighing him, not the uniform, but him. She looked at his name tag. "Officer Marcus," she said, her voice still level. "I have been coming here on this day for 30 years. I have never been the public. Please step aside." Now Marcus was embarrassed. A few people were looking. He felt his authority being questioned by this grandma. "Ma'am," he said, his voice losing its fake kindness. "I can't do that. You can wait with everyone else, or you'll have to move back. I don't want to have to call my supervisor." It was a small, petty threat, but it was all he had. Emily looked at him for a long moment. The steel in her eyes was unmistakable, but she simply nodded once, a sharp, precise movement. Then she turned and walked away. Marcus watched her go, satisfied. Problem solved. He straightened his tie, puffed his chest out again. He had maintained order. He turned his attention back to the entrance, scanning for the black sedans. He had no idea, not the slightest inkling of the storm he had just invited. Emily didn't go to the public area. She simply retreated to the edge of the memorial, standing partially hidden by one of the large granite slabs, and she waited. To understand what happened next, you have to understand the cold. Not the November DC cold, but the other cold. The cold that lived in Emily's bones, the cold she'd earned 60 years ago, 30,000 feet above the frozen ridges of North Korea. She stood there, hidden from Marcus, and the scent of the damp juniper bushes and the cold stone transported her. She wasn't in DC anymore. She was in the rattling, vibrating cockpit of an unarmed reconnaissance plane, a Douglas RB-26 Invader, painted midnight black with no markings. She wasn't Emily. She was Silver Hawk. That's what they called her. She'd been part of a unit so secret it didn't officially exist. While the history books talked about the dogfights, she and a handful of other pilots, women, mostly, borrowed from the reserves, utterly deniable, flew the gaps. They flew low and fast over enemy supply lines at night with no escorts, counting trucks, spotting anti-aircraft batteries, taking the pictures that decided the next day's battles. It was terrifying, isolating work. Her call sign was a whisper on the radio, a phantom. She'd been shot at, she'd been hit, she'd limped back on one engine more times than she could count. She was looking at the 19 steel statues, but she wasn't seeing them. She was seeing the real faces. She was seeing the 8th Ranger Company trapped on a hillside, surrounded, She was seeing the young lieutenant on the radio, his voice cracking with fear as mortar fire rained down. "Hawk, we need a way out. We can't see the pass." She had taken her plane back, made a pass so low she could see the flashes of their rifles. She'd flown through a curtain of enemy fire, her navigator screaming, just to draw their attention, just to give the Rangers the 30 seconds they needed to break for the pass. She'd brought her plane back that night looking like Swiss cheese, her navigator wounded, but she'd brought it back. And the Rangers, most of them made it. That young lieutenant, he'd made it. His name was Thomas Clark. He was one of the ghosts she was here to visit. She wasn't just a veteran. She was a legend. A ghost story that old pilots told. But her records were sealed, classified for 75 years. The unit was disbanded, its members sworn to secrecy, their contributions buried under national security. She wasn't a hero. Officially, she was just Emily Jensen, a retired government clerk. The black sedans arrived at 8:55. Doors opened. Marcus snapped to attention, his frustration with Emily forgotten. He felt the thrill of importance. A senator stepped out, all smiles and handshakes, and then the general. This was General Harrison, 4 stars, a man who commanded armies. He was tall, stern, his chest a tapestry of ribbons. He walked with a purpose that radiated energy. Marcus gave his best salute. "Good morning, General. Welcome." The general gave him a curt nod, his eyes already on the memorial. The small VIP group began to move along the roped-off path toward the pool of remembrance. This was the moment. Emily stepped out from behind the granite slab. She started walking, not running, but with that same relentless, determined pace straight toward the gap in the stanchions where the VIPs were entering. Marcus saw her. His blood ran cold. Not now. Not her again. "Ma'am!" he shouted, his voice cracking with panic. "Ma'am, I told you. Stop." He sprinted the few yards and physically planted himself in front of her, blocking her path just as the general's entourage was passing. He was red-faced, angry, and humiliated. This old woman was making him look incompetent in front of a 4-star general. "Ma'am, I am ordering you to step back. This is a restricted area." His voice was loud now, unprofessional. The general and the senator paused. They looked over, annoyed by the disturbance. The small crowd of tourists was definitely watching, phones starting to come out. This was the peak of the humiliation. Emily looked small, frail, and utterly defiant. She looked past Marcus, her eyes locking for a second with General Harrison. The general just saw a confused old woman causing a scene. He frowned, turning to his aide. Emily brought her gaze back to Marcus. She was perfectly calm. "Young man," she said, her voice dropping into a tone of command that was utterly at odds with her appearance. "You have interfered with my duties for the last time. I am here for the 8th Rangers. I am here for Lieutenant Clark. I will be at that pool." Marcus, now desperate, put his hand up, palm out, a gesture to physically push her back. "That's it. I'm calling the police. You are trespassing." He was yelling. She was a whisper. And this is when it happened. This was the moment. The freeze frame. The air, already thin with cold, seemed to get sucked out of the space. Marcus, his face contorted in anger, his hand raised to shove her. The crowd, silent, watching this awful, cringe-worthy scene of a young guard bullying an old woman. The general turning away in annoyance. Emily stood impossibly still. She looked at Marcus's raised hand. She looked at his name tag. She looked him dead in the eye. Her voice was not loud. It was low, precise, and carried the density of annealed steel. "You will lower your hand, Officer Marcus," she said. He flinched, surprised by her tone, but he didn't lower it. "Ma'am, you need to leave. Now." She took one small breath. She stood as tall as her 86 years would allow, and it suddenly seemed much taller than it had a moment before. "I am Colonel Emily Jensen, Air Force Special Operations, retired. My authorization code for this site, on this day, is Alpha Delta 9. Marcus just stared, confused. "What, ma'am, that's not..." "There are no codes." He thought she was delusional. "I have one last thing to say to you, son," she said, her voice sharp. "My active service call sign was Silverhawk." And that was it. The 2 words. Silverhawk. It was as if she had pulled the pin on a grenade. The world stopped. Marcus's hand, the one that had been raised to push her, froze in midair. His mouth hung open. The anger in his face didn't just fade, it evaporated, replaced by a profound, hollow shock. The tourists stopped filming. The wind rattled the stanchion rope, and it sounded like a gunshot in the silence. But it wasn't just Marcus. 10 yards away, General Harrison, who had been turning to walk away, stopped dead. He didn't just stop. He went rigid, as if he'd taken a bullet. He turned his head, slowly, his eyes wide, disbelief warring with a sudden, dawning terror. He looked at this small old woman in the simple wool coat. The name Silverhawk echoed in the cold air. A name that hadn't been spoken aloud in a place like this, a public place, in decades. It was a name that belonged to the shadows. It was a ghost story, and the ghost was standing right in front of them. The thaw was more violent than the freeze. General Harrison moved first. He was a 4-star general, a man who commanded respect in every room he entered, but you saw something break in his composure. He took 2 fast, stumbling steps toward Emily, pushing past his own stunned aide. He stopped about 3 feet from her, his eyes scanning her face, searching, desperate. He was trembling. Marcus was still frozen, his hand still ridiculously suspended in the air. The general's voice, when it came, was a raw, choked whisper. What did you say?" Emily met his gaze. She didn't repeat herself. She just held his stare. The general swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing. He seemed to be fighting for control. He looked from her to the memorial, and back. And then, he saw it. He saw her, the set of her jaw, the ice-blue eyes. It wasn't just an old woman. He knew the stories. Every officer at his level knew the legends from the classified histories. Silverhawk, the phantom pilot of Korea, the one who flew the Nightshade missions, the one who saved the 8th Rangers, the one listed as MIA for 2 years, then quietly repatriated and buried in the archives. He thought Silverhawk was a man. Everyone did. He looked at her, and his entire world tilted. In front of the senator, the dignitaries, and the crowd of tourists, General Harrison, a man covered in medals, a man who had met presidents, snapped to the sharpest, most profound salute of his life. His hand cracked against his brow, his back rigid as iron. "Colonel," he breathed, the word torn from him full of awe and shame. "Colonel Jensen. My God. Ma'am, I... He couldn't finish. He just held the salute. And that's when Marcus finally moved. His arm dropped to his side as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. The color drained from his face. He didn't understand the name, not really. But he understood the salute. He understood the look on the general's face. He understood, in that horrifying, sinking instant, that he had just threatened, yelled at, and raised his hand to someone that a 4-star general was saluting as if she were the royalty. The entire crowd was silent, watching this tableau. The small old woman, the trembling general saluting her, and the young guard, who looked like he was about to be sick. The general, still holding his salute, spoke, his voice tight. "Officer," he barked at Marcus, not even looking at him. "Clear the path now." Marcus fumbled with the rope stanchion, his hands shaking so badly he could barely unclip it. He pulled it aside, creating a wide opening. He was backing away, trying to disappear, but General Harrison wasn't done. He lowered his salute, but only to turn to his aide and the shocked senator. His voice was loud now, clear, meant for everyone to hear. He was making a proclamation. "This is Colonel Emily Jensen," he announced, his hand gesturing toward her. "If you've read your history, your real history, you know the name Silverhawk." He turned his gaze on Marcus, and it was withering. "This officer," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "was just doing his job." Then he turned back to the crowd. "Silverhawk flew 120 classified reconnaissance missions over North Korea. She flew unarmed, at night, into the thickest anti-aircraft fire of the war. She is credited single-handedly with saving the 8th Ranger Company from annihilation at Hill 581. She was shot down, captured, and held as a POW for 2 years. He took a breath, his voice thick with emotion. "Her records were sealed. She never received a public commendation. She asked for nothing." He looked at Emily, his eyes filled with a profound, personal gratitude. "My father, Lieutenant Thomas Clark, was the commander of that Ranger Company. He told me about the hawk who saved them. He spent his entire life trying to find out who she was to thank her. He died not knowing." He straightened up. "It is my honor." The honor of my entire life, to finally meet you, Colonel. My father, he would have... He couldn't speak. He just shook his head. The crowd was stunned. You could hear people whispering, "Silver Hawk." Oh my God. The veterans in the caps were slowly, one by one, raising their hands in a salute. They understood. They knew what she was. And Marcus finally understood. He hadn't just disrespected an old woman. He had desecrated a monument, a living, breathing monument. Marcus felt the blood roaring in his ears. He wanted to run. He wanted to rewind time. He saw his career, his ambitions, his entire sense of self just crumble. He had yelled at her. He had raised his hand to her. He stepped forward, his legs feeling like lead. He stopped in front of Emily, who was now being flanked by the general. "Ma'am," he started, his voice a pathetic squeak. He cleared his throat. "Ma'am, Colonel, He was shaking. Tears of pure, abject shame were welling in his eyes. "I didn't know. I am so sorry. There's no excuse, I'm sorry." Emily finally looked at him, really looked at him. There was no anger in her eyes. There was no triumph. There was just a deep, profound sadness, a weariness. She looked at this young, terrified man, and she saw the whole world. The world that forgets, the world that moves on, the world that only sees what's on the surface. She reached out, very slowly, and her small, gloved hand rested for just a second on his forearm. His entire body flinched at her touch. "That's the point, son," she said, her voice impossibly gentle but so tired. "You never do. You see an old woman. You don't see the soldier. You don't see the sacrifice." She patted his arm once. "It's all right, officer. You were doing your job. Your orders were just incomplete." She then turned to the general. "General Clark, it's an honor to meet you. Your father was a good man, a brave man. I'm glad he made it home." General Harrison, completely undone, offered her his arm. "Colonel, please, will you lead us?" Emily nodded. She took his arm, and together, the 4-star general and the 86-year-old ghost walked past the rope, down the path to the pool of remembrance. Marcus was left alone on the walkway. The crowd was silent, parting for her. As she passed, Marcus didn't just step aside. He snapped his body to attention, his back so straight it must have hurt, and he threw his right hand up in the most desperate, respectful, and broken salute of his life. He held it, unmoving, his eyes locked on her back, tears streaming unchecked down his face. The rest of the ceremony, well, it didn't happen. Not as planned. When Emily and General Harrison reached the pool, the senator and the Korean dignitaries just stepped back. They formed a half circle. The official wreaths were forgotten. The speeches were abandoned. The whole event, the pomp, the circumstance, it all just dissolved in the presence of something real. Emily walked away from the general's arm. Moving to the edge of the granite pool, she looked down at the names, the lists of the fallen. The general stood behind her, at attention. The senator stood behind him, his hands clasped. The tourists, the students, the other veterans, they all just watched. They had formed a silent honor guard. Nobody spoke. Nobody clicked a camera. The only sound was the wind and the distant DC traffic. Emily reached into her clutch. She unfolded the silk handkerchief and took out the small tarnished medal. It was the Distinguished Flying Cross. She'd been awarded it in secret, in a windowless room at the Pentagon, and told never to wear it. She didn't look at it. She just knelt, her joints protesting, and placed it on the granite curb, right next to the etched name of a corporal from the 8th Rangers, a radio operator who had died calling in the coordinates. She placed her gloved hand over it. Her head bowed. She stayed there for a long time, maybe a minute, maybe 5. It felt like an eternity. The entire memorial had become a church, and she was its only parishioner. Marcus was still at his post, frozen in that salute. He hadn't moved. His arm was shaking with the strain, but he didn't lower it. He was guarding her now. He was protecting her from the world that he had, just moments ago, represented. Finally, Emily pushed herself up. General Harrison moved to help, but she waved him off. She stood, took one last look, and nodded as if to say, "Mission complete." She turned, and the crowd, they just parted for her, silently. The respect was so thick you could feel it, heavier than the cold granite. She walked, alone, back down the path. She passed Marcus, who was still saluting, his face a mess of tears and snot. She didn't stop, but she met his eyes as she passed, and she gave him the smallest, slightest nod. A nod of forgiveness, a nod that said, "It's over." And then she was gone. She walked out of the memorial, onto the path, and headed back toward the bus stop, just an old woman in a wool coat disappearing back into the noise of the city, leaving behind a silence filled with a respect that had finally, 60 years too late,